Chapter 12, The Rise of the Modern Age. Part 2, Romanticism and Nationalism Stir to Life. French Nationalism. Ultimately, Napoleon had achieved stability and unity in revolutionary France only by focusing the country outward, towards its neighbors, in an imperialist quest to establish, through his conquering armies, control over all of Europe, and supposedly also to bring French enlightenment and reform in the process. Bringing the peasant class into the highly respected role of soldiering made Napoleon extremely popular among that class. In essence, he moved out into the world with a new national army, far more powerful, highly motivated, than the professional or paid troops of the European dynasties that Napoleon set out to topple. The response of the rest of Europe to Napoleonic nationalism. But his popularity and dominating role in French politics and French imperialism came at the price of making enemies of everyone else in Europe that was not French or was not completely engulfed in French culture, which at the time was the unifying culture of Europe's ruling classes. Ultimately, what Napoleon did in developing the idea of the French nation set loose the desire of other Europeans to find their own paths to acquiring a similar nationhood, that is, societies built on the cultural character of a whole people, Russian, Italian, German, Swedish, Polish, etc., societies that were not merely the private property of privileged dynasties. Other countries, England, Spain, Dutch Netherlands, who already had laid out national foundations of their own, also found their respective national sentiments strengthened further by the same Napoleonic challenge. America, of course, had laid out its national identity during the War of Independence from Britain. But with the lifting of the British challenge, not completed until the conclusion of the War of 1812, internal cultural differences rather quickly began to trouble America's own national journey, until it led to the brutal Civil War, deciding whether the United States would indeed stay united or whether it would split into a number of smaller political units, not just North versus South, but also East versus West, and with the idea of the total sovereignty of the individual states being greater than the national sovereignty, also serving to challenge any sense of national unity. Under Lincoln's leadership and divine counsel to Lincoln, this issue in America was resolved brutally, at the same time that Germany and Italy were struggling, also brutally, to find unity as new European nations. The role of Romanticism in growing the sense of nationhood. The French Revolution had challenged Europeans to investigate further this idea of building human progress on the basis of the ability of man, that is, any man or all men potentially, to reason clearly, if properly brought up to do so. But when given the chance to put this utopian dream into practice, the French had also failed miserably. Very, very miserably. A reaction against such worship of human reason naturally set in, not just among the skeptical British empiricists, but among a number of continental scholars, especially the German Romanticists. This latter reaction developed on the European continent, especially when it became obvious that under Napoleon, what stood behind French power was not reason, but some kind of special spirit that rose naturally out of the soul of an energized people themselves, French peasants thus becoming national warriors. This quest for such spirit, translated into the German as Geist, would mark much of European philosophy during the 1800s, especially that coming out of Germany, whose philosophers seemed to dominate the field of intellectual inquiry on the European continent that century, the way the French had done so the century before. The German Romanticists Herder and Goethe. Two young Germans, Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, helped found together the Sturm und Drang, that's storm and drive, movement of the 1770s, celebrating the spirit of struggle as a necessary element in achieving what the rationalists felt could be achieved through pure reason. Herder. The clergyman Herder studied under Kant at Königsberg, but moved away from Kantian rationalism into a mystical world presided over by God. As a young pastor, he met Goethe, inspiring the latter with his insights into biblical literature. He recognized that the Hebrew literature of the Old Testament was more of the nature of poetry and folk narrative than technical science, which was how rationalist Western society was coming to think and operate at that point, and that it was necessary to understand the Hebrew writings as such in order to comprehend their great truths. The two men became good friends whose speculations together about human knowledge birthed the Sturm und Drang movement, elevating human emotions above human intellect. Eventually, their thinking would settle down a bit and evolve towards classicism, or love of the styles of classical or ancient Greco-Roman antiquity, in an attempt to balance human emotion and human intellect. Herder was a strong German nationalist at a time when the Germans were attempting to construct the idea of a German nation. Because Germany at that time was divided into hundreds of independent states, large and small. Yet he was cautious about letting the highly emotional spirit of nationalism get too far away from practical reason. Then, with the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, Herder would support the revolution, producing a split between himself and many of his friends, including Goethe. Finally, his dedication to refuting Kant's theories would place him pretty much in isolation within the German academic community. Goethe. Goethe was an individual of wide tastes and talents, being a poet, dramatist, and scientist all in one. He was early influenced by Herder, who inspired in him a deep appreciation of German folk culture and consequently a spirit of German nationalism. But Goethe was also a profound individualist, intrigued by the power and depth of personal experience and emotion. In his first play, Götz von Berlichingen, 1773, Goethe explored the depths of individual human sentiments and laid the foundation for the Sturm und Drang movement, which, among other things, advocated personal freedom in the face of oppressive medieval attitudes in Germany concerning the role of the individual in society. This movement would later blossom into German Romanticism. In the 1780s, Goethe went to Rome to study classic art, architecture, and literature, and for a while came under the more formalistic style of the neoclassicist movement. But on his return to Germany, he found little appreciation for his new views. He then turned to science for a while. But his longer-standing romantic inclinations reasserted themselves, and his independent, individualistic style returned to the fore. This culminated in his all-time great work, Faust, actually written and rewritten in two parts over a long period of time, reaching perhaps from 1772 to 1829, which was an epic tale of the search of the individual for that which is of a lasting or a transcending value in the face of freedom's great opportunities and uncertainties. His Faust would be the best-read work of German literature, roughly equivalent to the place Shakespeare has long enjoyed in English literature, inspiring young Germans for generations to quest for the German ideal, the romantic spirit or soul that made Germany unique among the nations. Herder and Goethe's ideas would leave their mark on German nationalist thinking, although both of them moved on into the philosophy of classicism, which idealized the cultural and political achievements of the ancient Greeks and Romans, who became for them models that Europeans should attempt to emulate, as it was also for the Americans at the time, who took up the Roman idea of the Republic as the political structure they were trying to set up in 1787. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Historical Progress Through Struggle. Just as Goethe was become Germany's grand poet of the century in Germany, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel would become Germany's grand philosopher of the century. Hegel built on the Sturm und Drang idea of the blessings of struggle, seeing in the tension between opposing forces, usually in the form of newer, radical ideas and practices challenging older, established ideas and practices. He sees in that the possibilities of birthing a new standard, operating on a higher social level than previously. This idea eventually became his famous dialectic, the struggle of two opposing things eventually birthing a third, superior thing, in all aspects of material as well as biological and social or cultural development on this planet. Hegel's Weltgeist. But he added to this purely mechanical formula the idea that the process itself was not random, but instead guided by a superior Weltgeist, or world spirit, or world mind, or just simply God, that was directly involved in the entire process as part of a quest for the completion of history, with the full union in a state of perfect love of all things together. Even God, especially in the form of the living Jesus, was part of this process, seeking his own completion in union with man, or man in union with him, when all would be one in a perfect state of love and peace. From this point on, virtually all the 1800s sense of progress, not just in Germany, but in much of the whole of Western civilization, was shaped by the idea not just of philosophers sitting in their salons, directing others rationally towards a utopian world, but by the direct involvement of those who would bring history forward through noble struggle directed by some great spirit. Without such struggle, violent though it might be, progress was impossible. Hegelianism also touched on group pride, as nations or classes came to see themselves as being under the special anointing of the world spirit, to take the lead, to direct history to the next era. This fed powerfully into German nationalism, with its sense of special German historical destiny. This also fed powerfully into the working class movement, which came to view the industrial workers of the world as the true moral underpinning of the world to come.